Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US-based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you. I'm always glad to be here.
Welcome to the show once again. So, Irina, several big topics today. Let's this time to take the topic of very closer home, Afghanistan and Pakistan. It broke out. There was a fight that broke out, and there were rumors that India is somewhere connected. Taliban's normalization of ties with India, it may be in the back behind and all those things. But now I see that there is some sort of a ceasefire and resolving of issues happening since yesterday. Those news came. Help us understand what happened, what is happening, what should we expect in the future. It's very closer to India, and so we are all watching.
So the situation, the tensions between the Taliban and Pakistan have been growing over the last few weeks, and they started with sort of a semi-sporadic border crashes. There was an attempt to assassinate a fighter, a leader who ended up in a hospital and survived the strike. Essentially, the Taliban became increasingly more aggressive and employed a greater degree of violence on Pakistan's territory. Um, and it became, from these border crashes, it became much more about essentially um, um, more linked to deeper underlying issues between the two countries: legitimacy, sovereignty, influence in the region. Uh, Essentially, previously, Pakistan was seen as a patron of Afghanistan, and including the Taliban, and Kabul was seen as dependent on the country. That because the relationships have always had some tensions, but recently has a lot of it has come to a head. The Pakistan's military establishment has always treated the Taliban as a strategic asset, but now it feels betrayed by its own creation, sort of a Frankenstein's monster that's come to life and gotten out of hand. The issue here now is more than just a new foreign policy track. There is something resembling almost an existential crisis from Pakistan's point of view, because the Taliban has compounded the ongoing terrorist issues that Pakistan has been facing, and uh, now that they have a control of an entire country, they're much harder to rein in. Now, indeed, there's been talks about a potential normalization with India. Obviously, India benefits from Pakistan being distracted with the Taliban and refocusing its attention to internal matters rather than on sparking infighting and attacks on Kashmir, as happened only a couple months ago. Um, but full normalization with the Taliban would be a really huge step. After all, it's a fundamentalist Islamist organization. It has messed and forged relations with other extremist movements and terrorist organizations in the region. And it's one thing to sort of benefit from a distance over clashes in Pakistan, totally different to host the Taliban and to give them a stamp of political approval. Nevertheless, those discussions are happening, and the Taliban has visited India for talks, which in itself is groundbreaking given that it has been seen for many years as a creation of Pakistan and as a potential threat. Um, uh, the, from Taliban's perspective, isolation has weakened them significantly, and it has weakened other highly ideological regimes. So now it's looking to expand legitimacy by diversifying its relationships. So, to some extent, engaging with India is a calculated provocation that challenges Pakistan, challenges its sense of dominance, and signals to the international community that Afghanistan can, under Taliban's rule, can still act independently. For India, this is an opportunity to regain influence in the region beyond its own borders, which was lost since the US withdrew from Afghanistan. Um, this sort of um, engagement is not new. Indian intelligence has been operating in Afghanistan for quite some time. But on a political level, this sort of discrete overture is sort of a groundbreaking event and potentially could reshape the strategic architecture of the region. It's also contributing to paranoia in Pakistan. The military is concerned about an ongoing domestic insurgency in the border provinces. Its economy is in extremely poor shape. Basically, one could say it's on life support. So now the sense of betrayal from the Taliban is exacerbated by the compounding of these issues. The fact that these domestic internal skirmishes can actually be ignited even further by Taliban's intervention is a concern. So the Pakistan engaged in airstrikes on Afghan positions near Khost and Kandahar, and it's sort of a desperate attempt to reassert leverage. But what, but it kind of backfired because for Taliban that only reinforced their sense of autonomy and fueled nationalism internally, which the Taliban is trying to feed off. It's grossly unpopular. It has isolated most of its citizens, even the men who haven't been part of the Taliban infrastructure have limited opportunities for work, so the economy is really in terrible shape as well. But this is giving everyone something to rally around the flag, so to speak. Um, the situation, even if there is a current attempt at a rapprochement, the underlying issues have not been resolved, and it will not be easy to resolve them. Now, of course, for the US, this is an opportunity. Uh, the Trump administration prefers generally to let regional actors exhaust one another before coming in as an arbiter. Um, Now there's an opportunity for the US to reassert its diplomatic footprint without committing troops, which Trump is very reluctant to do. Allegedly, Trump is behind the back channel that has led to the current ceasefire negotiations. The back channel included, um, but more clearly, there's more clear evidence than those rumors that the Trump administration was the one that set up the back channel between Indian intelligence and the Taliban that has led to these more advanced political discussions, and that seems to me more plausible. Um, Essentially, Trump is looking to use India as a proxy stabilizer in place of the US. And at the very least, US would benefit from securitization of this region. In reality, it means that Trump is not against India's outreach to the Taliban or the Taliban's outreach to India, so long as the impact involves weakening other terrorist organizations, potentially constraining Pakistan, and certainly limiting China's regional footprint. Now, for China, of course, this leads to several complications. because it was hoping to use Afghanistan as a trade corridor, also for mineral extraction. Specifically, it had an interest in the Vahan route connecting it to Central Asia. Recent breakdown in communications and deals between the two countries, and between Pakistan and Afghanistan, puts these ambitions into jeopardy. Um, and Beijing, let's recall, has invested very heavily in Pakistan's infrastructure through CPEC. The instability is threatening the physical safety of its personnel, and of course, the financing, the financial viability of these projects. Let's recall that at least one port that was under construction has been put on hold already, even before these latest developments. Now, additional fighting can endanger even more projects. Something that, of course, the U.S. would be more likely to celebrate. So now China is kind of stuck trying to defend itself. Trying to defend Pakistan diplomatically, but also trying to resolve its own tensions with the Taliban, and kind of mirroring a pragmatic approach that India has also adopted in this situation. Let's recall that before all of this happened, the Taliban and China's relationships has suffered a fallout. There was a breach of an major oil deal, and the Taliban was not present at the SCO summit in China. So meanwhile, there's also an intelligence war going on. Um, the Pakistan, through ISI, is trying to infiltrate the Taliban rank, even as diplomats are doing their job. The Indian intelligence is trying to use assorted intermediaries to discuss trade, security, and potential intelligence exchanges related to the uh, ISKIP, or Islamic State Khorasan. Each side um, has been leaking stories to the international media to try to undercut each other's credibility. Kabul has been trying to play all sides in various ways. It's sort of been flirting with India, publicly accusing Islamabad of aggression, consolidating national unity at home, and trying to secure Western sympathy for its situation. Uh, and there's also a new military asymmetry between the that was revealed as a result of this recent round of fighting. The Taliban is, of course, poorly equipped by conventional standards, even with all the equipment left behind by the United States. A lot of it has been sold off to Iran and to other places. Uh, but it has a symbolic advantage from at least some of the remaining armored vehicles and weapons. The Pakistani troops are more accustomed to counterinsurgency rather than high intensity conflict, and they're not necessarily prepared for long engagements, sustained engagements in a very difficult mountainous terrain. So the inconclusive clashes that we have witnessed have actually weakened both sides and did not result in any clear victory for either side. For Afghanistan, though, there is a political outcome out of this, legitimizing the Taliban government as a defender of national sovereignty. For Pakistan, it reveals the limits of its regional dominance. And speaking of Southeast Asia in general, it could be seen as a potential turning point. The old alliances are shifting and fragmenting, new ones are coming into play. India is less passive and is sort of re entering the great game. The Taliban is, whether it's actually planning to normalize or not, it may still play a greater role in regional politics. Um, so, if the Taliban India dialogue continues to develop, that alone could alter the balance of influence in the entire area and weaken China's position regarding the Indian Ocean and Central Asia. and also marginalized Pakistan as a potential intermediary. Now, I'm very skeptical personally that full normalization is imminent. Um, but the mere discussions are having a significant psychological impact. Uh, Pakistan it's forcing Pakistan into a defensive position, and Afghanistan is suddenly in a role to dictate the rules of engagement and to be seen as a rising actor. Um, and we are seeing that the vacuums left, such as the one that was left behind by U.S. withdrawal, eventually get filled by somebody. And in this case, that somebody is Taliban taking on a much more active and independent role.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, to understand it better, what is guiding Afghanistan's policy here? What is it that they finally want to achieve? And now there are ceasefire talks and reports I saw. What does it mean? Where does this whole situation go from here with all those different players, so-called or allegedly involved in all ways? And it's interesting to learn that US is wanting India to play a very pivotal role amidst all the tensions between tariffs, Trump tariffs, and Russian friendship and all.
Yes, well, from the Taliban's point of view, the main objective is more political than military, because I think even they realize that they're ill equipped to confront Pakistan's military for an extended period of time. I think the idea is to cause enough um, temporary damage, tactical damage, to be seen as a force to be reckoned with and to be taken seriously on the international stage, and just to achieve a psychological victory and deal a psychological blow to Pakistan, and to leverage these developments into potential political gains elsewhere, openings with the United States, over normalization with India, with other countries. So it's a game. For the Taliban, it's a game. It's not necessarily about winning a war. It's more about using the chaos in a strategic way to attain political benefits. Um, but as for the United States, they're separating the different issues. The trade issues with India, they're separating from security, whereas India is less inclined to do so and kind of sees their relationship as part of the same package. But because Trump is so transactional in his approach, even with strategically important partners, um, it's obvious that he does not see any contradiction at all between having a dispute over one issue while benefiting and being somewhat indirectly involved in another issue that essentially benefits the US without necessitating a major, commitment.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. And talking of India and the US, India and Trump, how should we read this now? Where we are going on this trade tariff thing? Because the stocks are continuing. In the meantime, Mr. Trump says, India will stop buying Russian oil, and India denies. What's happening? Where are we heading on this?
Well, today the big development is that US announced um, direct sanctions against two of Russia's largest oil companies. So that's going to have an impact, leaving a lot of questions about what China and India are both going to do. In the meantime, the actual talks with India have been sort of paradoxical. On the one hand, a lot of economic brinkmanship. On the other hand, a pursuit of a strategic partnership on aspects of it. Um, Trump continues to maintain that India has agreed to curtail its purchases of Russian oil. India has disagreed with that. Uh, Trump essentially made that assertion to claim a victory for US pressure. Um, the truth is, there is sort of a gray zone between political signaling and economic pragmatism. India does not want to alienate Russia, and it also is um, angry and cornered by Trump's tariffs, but it doesn't want to come to clash with Washington in the open either. For Trump, this is less about forcing India into some sort of a bigger energy deal necessarily, as about simply displaying spectacle and power, and doing some sort of a political theater for his domestic audiences, and also using it as leverage in trying to reshape global supply chains away from China as well. Now, there is a discussion that a potential agreement is in the works that would reduce the tariffs from 50% to 15. It's not clear how close that is to actually coming into place, but the fact that it's at least under discussion is a very positive sign. Neither side can afford to destroy the relationship. Um, for Trump, having India turn away completely would undermine his entire Indo-Pacific strategy and undermine the possibilities of other economic corridors like IMEC. For India too, the relationship with the US provides various security and trade advantages, and the distrust with China is simply too big for India to be able to pivot completely. And while Russia can be a source of trade over cheap pharmaceuticals, in reality, the market in the United States is both bigger and more desirable. And the US, the Russian economy simply cannot be compared to the US. All of these factors are weighing in very heavily in the calculus of how this is all being handled. Uh, uh, Trump will present any such tariff reductions as a victory, essentially trying to balance economic needs with populist messaging. India is willing to play along to some extent, and some of these threats are very clearly transactional rather than ideological. Um, some symbolic gestures will be made by both sides. Um, Modest tariff adjustments, minor defense contracts, and all of that will sort of appease Washington without making huge and irreversible commitments. Now, the oil issue here comes into play, presenting its own set of dilemmas because Russia is still India's largest supplier of discounted crude, and it's a major economic lifeline given the rising global prices. Um, so Trump, I don't know whether he's actually expecting India to fully drop all of that immediately. It's less about stating facts than making political projections to demonstrate US authority, even when he does not really have a clear enforcement mechanism. Um, the reality is, Indian refiners are continuing to import Russian oil through intermediaries and rebranding it to avoid sanctions. There's this quiet defiance that aims at underscoring India's strategic independence, and none of it is new. It's been India's foreign policy since the Cold War. But at the same time, India is looking to be indispensable to both sides. Um, it maintains energy ties with Moscow. It's trying to reduce tariffs with Washington, and it's also presenting itself as a bridge between two rival blocs. And actually, to some extent, Trump's transactional approach helps it to do so. On the one hand, yes, Trump is a huge uh, places huge bets on loyalty. At the same time, he admires strength. The fact that India is acting assertively, but also not alienating him, flatters his worldview of negotiation as combat. And so, even though India is defying some of the US demands, um, Trump is framing this whole thing as part of his larger tough talks narrative about how the negotiations are difficult and preserves the illusion of dominance in this context. The bigger issue, though, is strategic. These tariff talks are not just about trade, they're also about global supply chains, the contest for technological influence. US wants to draw India into its semiconductor and defense ecosystems as a counterweight to China, which means making India more dependent on US technology, both for logistical and interoperability reasons, and also as a matter of making it less able to get non-Western weapons systems. Um, for India, it's leverage. So it's also wants concessions in return. It wants access to technology. It wants relaxed visa regimes. It wants recognition of its regional ambitions, and um, you know this it doesn't want to be treated as a junior partner. That is a bottom line. It wants to be seen and treated as an emerging power demanding parity. um, for Russia, all of this is, of course, puts it in a very uncomfortable position because it's also dependent on Indian purchases. It needs somebody to stabilize its wartime economy, which is doing worse by the day. It cannot openly confront Trump's pressure campaign without jeopardizing its own diplomatic outreach. So it's trying to act indifferent, while also considering even bigger discounts, logistical support for India. So nobody's being fully transparent and honest in this sort of logistical and strategic dance. Everybody is trying to cooperate while also pursuing obvious self interests. China is looking to exploit any friction it can. It wants to offer India selective trade openings and certainly wants to create more of daylight between Washington and New Delhi. But the historical distrust, the underlying potential for border tensions make all of this extremely superficial. India will remain committed to strategic economy. It will not align fully with any camp for the time being, but it will also prevent everybody else from trying to isolate it. So we're seeing kind of a new model of diplomacy emerging out of this scenario, a transactional multipolarity of sorts. Uh, the US under Trump rewards loyalty with tariffs, punishes defiance with social media outbursts, and um, the alliances are based on financial value. But India remains sort of an ambiguous player, thriving to some extent, trying to be indispensable to everyone, uh, both denying certain things but also affirming and playing into Trump's act to some extent. That allows both sides to claim victory for domestic audiences without breaking relations and being able to move forward with the strategic priorities. Um, what does that all add up to in the end? Trump's coercive economic strategy is starting to lose traction. Tariffs uh, have been used as a very blunt instrument of leverage, but they are now leading to more and more countries creatively evading enforcement rather than complying altogether. So countries like India are showing that various US partners are now able to navigate Trump's unpredictability um, through their own version of transactionalism, theater, and self-interest. So India is not only surviving Trump's brand of diplomacy, but internalizing and mirroring it to some extent.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So let's move from dealmaker Trump to peacemaker Trump. What's happening to his, ceasefire plan, phase one? What went wrong and what went right? How is it panning out?
So in the beginning, we kind of felt the same energy that sort of defines much of his foreign policy. Very bold optics, immediate action, minimal patience for nuance. So phase one was supposed to symbolize the transition from war to peace, a decisive break from years of cyclical conflict and everybody's exhaustion with the 2 years of protracted warfare with Gaza. But of course, as so many of Trump's grand political performances, while the choreography appeared to be perfect, the substance was fatally flawed. The first weeks after the deal are already showing the strengths and contradictions of Trump's diplomatic style. On the one hand, he was clearly able to force rapid movement where so many others have failed, but on the other hand, he is unable to sustain it because this infrastructure of the deal is already falling apart. So initially, the administration achieved what many had thought to be impossible. Israel agreed to withdraw to borders. Um, Everybody got into the same page with endorsing a framework which was seen both ambitious and ambiguous at the same time. Um, the Trump and the MAGA people claimed that it was a triumph of pragmatism over ideology. They claimed that economic reconstruction would erode extremism, that facts on the ground would make, continuing of hostilities simply unprofitable even for Hamas. And the imagery played right into that. American envoys, Arab ministers, Qatari pledges of funding, everybody celebrating and hugging, and Israel's agreement to a limited reconstruction. All of that signaled that a major breakthrough was imminent. So, what went right in the first initial stage of phase one was the optics of decisiveness, the Trump's team willingness to bypass bureaucratic process, um, the disdain for interagency paralysis, insistence on visible results, compelled actors who usually delay and equivocate to move very quickly. The Israeli government was afraid of antagonizing Washington, and they agreed to temporary concessions. Hamas was already facing internal exhaustion and needed a break. It was becoming increasingly isolated even by Arab states, so it accepted the ceasefire as a tactical reprieve. Egypt, Jordan, other countries were pragmatic, not necessarily happy about the way it was done, but they were stepping in as guarantors. It seemed that the momentum itself was sort of almost a substitute for consensus. However, this is where we get to the part that went horribly, horribly wrong, and almost immediately at that. The ceasefire lacked a viable enforcement mechanism. So it basically relied on mutual exhaustion. The disarmament provisions were symbolic. There was, J.D. Vance consequently admitted that the US has no infrastructure for disarming Hamas by force. The transitional authority that was supposed to govern Gaza existed only in theory, and now we're seeing that Hamas is actually seizing the initiative not only to execute critics on the street, not only to infiltrate civil institutions in Gaza and to reconsolidate power in areas it was at one point forced to desert, but to actually start forming a government that would consist of Hamas and Fatah representatives. And we already know how this combined government had worked out in 2006. They governed for about a year and a half, after which Hamas proceeded to seize power unilaterally, cancel any prospects of elections, and to throw its rivals, partners off the rooftops in Gaza. The United States has been unwilling to commit a real force of peacekeepers. It sent about 200 troops to Israel to watch over the process, but it's not really a peacekeeping force. It's more of an observer force, and it assumed that regional actors would fill the vacuum. Surprise, nobody wants to commit troops. Everybody is afraid of Hamas. Egypt lacks the economic resources, and they certainly don't want to be involved in an indefinite mission. Egypt has been training Palestinians as a potential security force, and they're offering that. But who knows whether those guys are up to the par and whether they're even trustworthy. And everybody essentially underestimated Hamas's organizational resilience, overestimated the capacity of external pressure to alter ideological conviction, though none of that should have come as any surprise. Um, and of course, there is now a concern that any Qatari funding will just, and any international funding will just go back directly to Hamas and reinforce the cycle that was supposed to be broken by all of this. So we are seeing the shuttling of diplomats, J.D. Vance, Kushner, Witkoff traveling back and forth to Israel, claiming that the deal is holding and that everything is going to work out in the end. But meantime, what's happening on the background? On the background, Trump and Israel may have given up on the idea of taking control of Gaza, and instead they're talking about breaking Gaza into an Israeli and a Hamas controlled part. How that's going to be enforced, nobody knows, because Hamas is everywhere, and that would mean that basically Israel would need to permanently occupy some portion of Gaza closest to its own borders or strategically important, while Hamas gets to keep the rest with no guarantee that the Israeli forces will not be under constant attack. And of course, while all of this is going on, the pro-Hamas rallies around the world are continuing unabated. The ceasefire now people turn out to be no ceasefire at all people. Once the ceasefire was declared, far from celebrating, they are pushing for Hamas to consolidate control. And of course, the same people have nothing to say about Hamas execution of civilians on the streets and its violent clashes with political clans opposed to its authority. Some of them are backed by Israel, others are not. But regardless, Hamas is managing to essentially, through sneak attacks, outdo all of them and re-emerge as the controlling force on the ground.
Absolutely, absolutely. Irina, we have to wait and see how long this lasts. But moving on from this one to, as a peacemaker, why is Mr. Trump not succeeding in this Ukraine-Russia thing? What is holding him back? He's been having meetings and meetings with both sides, and still, we are talking about one side there's a talk of tomahawks, and one side there's talk of Putin, but then there is no talk. Help us understand what's happening, what's holding him back from establishing peace in this part of the world.
Quite honestly, Trump was never really ready to commit tomahawks. He used it as a symbolic pressure point against Russia and essentially to signal toughness to his domestic critics, but I don't think he ever really was interested in providing tomahawks. First of all, he believes that it will take too long to train the Ukrainians how to use them. Second, he just does not want to provide those weapons to Ukraine and doesn't want to be seen as responsible for long-range strikes by Ukraine. And third, I think he kept holding out hope that Russia would somehow miraculously pull off some sort of a diplomatic move that would let him vindicate his earlier approach. So we have seen that despite a lot talk about the tomahawks, and despite the fact that Zelensky was led to believe that at least the administration would be open to the discussion, Hexet and other officials signaled that tomahawks were likely off the table from the very beginning. So the same, mixed messaging we have seen play out right before the really bad Zelensky meeting with Trump in February. And I have to say, the meeting between Zelensky and Trump this time around was not much better from everything I heard. And the bottom line is, not only did Zelensky walk away with no tomahawks, but he didn't get any concessions from the administration. Now, there's a lot of talk about the 2-hour Putin call that allegedly convinced Trump to not give tomahawks to Zelensky. Without a doubt, Putin's agenda was to ensure that that would not happen in case Trump was actually considering it. But more importantly than just the tomahawks, it was also to undermine the meeting with Zelensky in general and to get Trump to do and say exactly what he ended up doing and saying, which was to yell at Zelensky to change his position back on essentially trying to force Zelensky into unilateral territorial concessions and to move away from any sort of military backing of Ukraine. Now, Putin overplayed his card because he himself misled Trump and others into believing that he would be open to a meeting in Budapest to discuss the prospects of a ceasefire. Of course, as soon as the meeting with Zelensky was over and became clear that Trump did exactly what he was expected to do, Putin basically announced that he was not really interested in the meeting, and to the extent he was going to come, it was only to insist that the takeover of Ukraine would continue. The result, of course, was that the administration finalized the calling of the summit, announced the sanctions against the oil companies, but at the same time did not back down on denying the tomahawks to Ukraine. And furthermore, when an article came out claiming that Trump approved the use of other long-range weapons, Western long-range weapons by Ukraine, which were previously blocked by the Pentagon, Trump claimed to have had issued no such statement and having had nothing to do with the weapons that Ukraine has to begin with. All of that is indicating that while the administration has finally tired out of Russia's continuous spoiler role, it is not really ready to give full backing to Ukraine, and it certainly has not modified its rhetoric regarding its territorial sovereignty. Although I think for the moment at least the hopes of a diplomatic resolution have been put aside.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now let's move on to our last story of the day, as well as a big superpower, China. Chinese spy scandal in the UK and US. What's happening in there? Again, a new thing. The last we heard was about the balloon and all those things. So many other things in between, and now another spy scandal.
Right. So two things were happening almost simultaneously on that front. Um, in the UK, there was an exposure of Chinese operatives who were embedded in political circles, and essentially they were ultimately not put on trial because the political establishment in UK, read the Labour government, couldn't decide that China was actually a threat or an adversary, and for that reason they could not define what these operatives were doing as malign influence or espionage. That led to a huge backlash from assorted corners, including both the Conservatives and the Reform Party. Meanwhile, it turns out that Prince Andrew, who was already under scrutiny for his role in the Jeffrey Epstein network, was implicated after meeting with a Chinese spy and became, such a significant political liability, compounding an ongoing broader scandal with the political echelons. Meanwhile, all of that was uh, compounded by the events in the United States. The where a State Department employee who was essentially an Indian-born individual uh, who was actually sort of in charge of, countering these very things, was found to be essentially siphoning off um, uh, intel concerning technologies and potentially something more to China. He's been arrested. That caused a huge ruckus. Prince Andrew was sort of the fall guy in all of this. Um, the royal family got tired of shenanigans and requested that he resign from his official titles, such as the Duke of York. That also implicated his ex-wife, who had met with Epstein and also benefited from this Chinese scandal. Um, at the same time as all of this was going on, there was also a huge scandal involving the approval for for the new Chinese embassy, which is a monumental, colossal building, which is seen as a major spying complex and which the security establishment has warned against. The the entities, the agencies that were supposed to rule on whether to grant the permit ultimately kept postponing the issue. Um, Critics are saying that China's trade with UK will be imperiled if they do not receive the approval for the new embassy. So there's a fight between MI5 now and the diplomatic establishment and assorted other interests. There seems to be some coordinated leaks of strategy concerning the treatment of these two issues, even though the cases are separate but related to the same, to Beijing. Both Beijing, the security establishment is frustrated because years of warnings about China's reach have been ignored. Um, Trump has essentially personalized the crisis. He feels outmaneuvered by Chinese intelligence. He blames the deep state and incompetence, Obama era complacency and operatives, but of course, some of it went on and on his watch as well. He is doubling down on tariffs, and he is basically treating espionage as an economic problem. But the threat is psychological as much as material. Not only are the Beijing's operatives trading in secrets, but also in perceptions. They're making elites question their loyalties, their friends, their safety. They're creating huge split between the elites and the public, and they're creating a perception of the West's moral decay and corruption. The same political networks that had ignored Epstein's victims and rationalized corruption are now discovering outrage at Chinese infiltration. And uh, this whole thing is turning out to be about more than just China, and also about the years of hollow virtue signaling and the challenges of transactional temptations and the cover-ups of internal scandals and the elites essentially dealing with the intelligence networks, with sex trafficking networks, and the intersection of the two. Um, what happened with Prince Andrew may be the beginning of the reckoning for some of these elites. The idea that privilege equates to immunity is now finally being shattered. Uh, but and it's sort of humiliating the entire political class, both in the UK and to some extent in the US. But for Beijing, the victory is not only in all the intelligence it managed to pilfer and to the political influence involving not being seen as a threat and being considered given being getting this huge spying complex, but the fact that it was managed to expose the fragility of Western elites, their vanity, and this polarization and this populist backlash against uh, what is seen as entrenched corruption. That's a huge visual optics victory for China, a messaging victory that they can now claim while asserting their own influence, that at least they're actually fighting corruption in their own ranks, that they're true to their own principles, and the West is weak, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lots of things happening in the world, and every 2 weeks we come here and help get a sense of all this that is happening through you. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.